The recorded history of Haiti began on 5 December 1492 when the European navigator Christopher Columbus happened upon a large island in the region of the western Atlantic Ocean that later came to be known as the Caribbean. It was inhabited by the Taino, an Arawakan people, who variously called their island Haiti, Bohio, or Quisquia. Columbus promptly claimed the island for the Spanish crown, naming it La Isla Española, later Latinized to Hispaniola. Pre-Spanish history. Successive waves of Arawak migrants, moving northward from the Orinoco Delta in South America, settled the islands of the Caribbean. Around AD 600, the Taino Indians, an Arawak culture, arrived on the island, displacing the previous inhabitants. They were organized into casicazgos, each led by a cacique. The Taino people called the island Quisquia and Haiti. At the time of Columbus's arrival in 1492, the island's territory consisted of 5 chiefdoms: Marién, Magua, Maguana, Juragua, and Higi. 2 of these chiefdoms, Marién and Juragua, were on the territory of present-day Haiti. Guac and Algarix, who ruled Marién from his capital El Garrico near present-day Cap Haitien, met Columbus and gave him permission to construct La Navidad. Juragua was the largest cacique on the island and ruled by Bohetio and his sister Anacauna, who ruled from its capital Yaguana near present-day Leogan, and later came into conflict with the Spanish. Spanish history. Christopher Columbus established the settlement, La Navidad, near the modern town of Cap Haitien. It was built from the timbers of his wrecked ship, Santa Maria, during his first voyage in December 1492. When he returned in 1493 on his second voyage, he found the settlement had been destroyed and all 39 settlers killed. Columbus continued east and founded a new settlement at La Isabela on the territory of the present-day Dominican Republic in 1493. The capital of the colony was moved to Santo Domingo in 1496. On the southwest coast of the island, also in the territory of the present-day Dominican Republic, the Spanish returned to western Hispaniola in 1502, establishing a settlement at Yaguana, near modern-day Leogan. A second settlement was established on the north coast in 1504 called Puerto Real near modern Fort Liberté, which in 1578 was relocated to a nearby site and renamed Baja. Following the arrival of Europeans, La Hispaniola's indigenous population suffered near extinction, in possibly the worst case of depopulation in the Americas. A commonly accepted hypothesis attributes the high mortality of this colony in part to Old World diseases to which the natives had no immunity. A small number of Tainos were able to survive and set up villages elsewhere. Spanish interest in Hispaniola began to wane in the 1520s, as more lucrative gold and silver deposits were found in Mexico and South America. Thereafter, the population of Spanish Hispaniola grew at a slow pace. The settlement of Yacanagua was burnt to the ground 3 times in its just over a century-long existence as a Spanish settlement. First by French pirates in 1543, again on the 27th of May 1592 by a 110-strong landing party from a 4-ship English naval squadron led by Christopher Newport in his flagship Golden Dragon, who destroyed all 150 houses in the settlement, and finally by the Spanish themselves in 1605, for reasons set out below. In 1595, the Spanish, frustrated by the 20-year rebellion of their Dutch subjects, closed their home ports to rebel shipping from the Netherlands, cutting them off from the critical salt supplies necessary for their herring industry. The Dutch responded by sourcing new salt supplies from Spanish America, where colonists were more than happy to trade. So large numbers of Dutch traders, pirates, joined their English and French brethren trading on the remote coasts of Hispaniola. In 1605, Spain was infuriated that Spanish settlements on the northern and western coasts of the island persisted in carrying out large-scale and illegal trade with the Dutch. who were at that time fighting a war of independence against Spain in Europe and the English, a very recent enemy state, and so decided to forcibly resettle their inhabitants closer to the city of Santo Domingo. This action, known as the Devastaciones de Osorio, proved disastrous. More than half of the resettled colonists died of starvation or disease. Over 100,000 cattle were abandoned, and many slaves escaped. 5 of the existing 13 settlements on the island were brutally razed by Spanish troops, including the 2 settlements on the territory of present-day Haiti, La Yaguana, and Bayajar. Many of the inhabitants fought, escaped to the jungle, or fled to the safety of passing Dutch ships. This Spanish action was counterproductive as English, Dutch, and French pirates were now free to establish bases on the island's abandoned northern and western coasts, where wild cattle were now plentiful and free. French Saint-Domingue. The foundation of a colony. French buccaneers established a settlement on the island of Tortuga in 1625, and were soon joined by like-minded English and Dutch privateers and pirates, who formed a lawless international community that survived by preying on Spanish ships and hunting wild cattle. Although the Spanish destroyed the buccaneers' settlements in 1629, 1635, 1638 and 1654, on each occasion they returned. In 1655, the newly established English administration on Jamaica sponsored the reoccupation of Tortuga under Elias Watts as governor. In 1660, the English made the mistake of replacing Watts as governor by a Frenchman, Jeremy Deschamps, on condition he defended English interests. Deschamps, on taking control of the island, proclaimed for the King of France, set up French colours, and defeated several English attempts to reclaim the island. It is from this point in 1660 that unbroken French rule in Haiti begins. In 1663, Deschamps founded a French settlement, Léogane, on the western coast of the island on the abandoned site of the former Spanish town of Yaguana. In 1664, the newly established French West India Company took control of the new colony, and France formally claimed control of the western portion of the island of Hispaniola. In 1665, they established a French settlement on the mainland of Hispaniola opposite Tortuga at Port-de-Paix. In 1670, the headland of Cap Français was settled further to the east along the northern coast. In 1676, the colonial capital was moved from Tortuga to Port-de-Paix. In 1684, the French and Spanish signed the Treaty of Ratisbon that included provisions to suppress the actions of the Caribbean privateers, which effectively ended the era of the buccaneers on Tortuga, many being employed by the French crown to hunt down any of their former comrades who preferred to turn outright pirate. Under the 1697 Treaty of Ryswick, Spain officially ceded the western 3/8 of Hispaniola to France, which renamed the colony Saint-Domingue. By that time, planters outnumbered buccaneers and, with the encouragement of Louis XIV, they had begun to grow tobacco, indigo, cotton, and cacao on the fertile northern plain, thus prompting the importation of African slaves, the ancestors of today's Haitians. Slave insurrections were frequent, and some slaves escaped to the mountains where they were met by what would be one of the last generations of Taino natives. After the last Taino died, the full-blooded Arawak population on the island was falsely said to be extinct. Today, many people are in search of their Taino-Arawak roots, some as a spiritual movement, some as a political movement, some as a cultural movement, though none are so far acknowledged as autochthonous by the political governments on either side of Hispaniola, and the split between the two sides of the island has so far continued. The Pearl of the Antilles in 1711. The city of Cap Français was formally established by Louis XIV and took over as capital of the colony from Port-de-Paix. In 1726, the city of Les Cayes was founded on the southern coast, which became the biggest settlement in the south. In 1749, the city of Port-au-Prince was established on the west coast, which in 1770 took over as the capital of the colony from Cap Français. However, that same year the 1770 Port-au-Prince earthquake and tsunami destroyed the city, killing 200 people immediately, and 30,000 later from famine and disease brought on by the natural disaster. This was the second major earthquake to hit Saint-Domingue, as it followed the 1751 Port-au-Prince earthquake, which had left only a single stone-built building standing in the town. Prior to the 7 Years' War, the economy of Saint-Domingue gradually expanded, with sugar and, later, coffee becoming important export crops. After the war, which disrupted maritime commerce, the colony underwent rapid expansion. In 1767, it exported 72 million pounds of raw sugar and 51 million pounds of refined sugar, 1 million pounds of indigo, and 2 million pounds of cotton. Saint-Domingue became known as the Pearl of the Antilles, one of the richest colonies in the 18th century French Empire. By the 1780s, Saint-Domingue produced about 40% of all the sugar and 60% of all the coffee consumed in Europe. This single colony, roughly the size of Hawaii or Belgium, produced more sugar and coffee than all of Britain's West Indian colonies combined. The labor for these plantations was provided by an estimated 790,000 African slaves. Between 1764 and 1771, the average importation of slaves varied between 10,000 and 15,000, by 1786 about 28,000, and, from 1787 onward, the colony received more than 40,000 slaves a year. However, the inability to maintain slave numbers without constant resupply from Africa meant the slave population, by 1789, totaled 500,000, ruled over by a white population that, by 1789, numbered only 32,000. At all times, a majority of slaves in the colony were African-born, as the brutal conditions of slavery prevented the population from experiencing growth through natural increase. African culture thus remained strong among slaves to the end of French rule, in particular the folk religion of Vodou, which commingled Catholic liturgy and ritual with the beliefs and practices of Guinea, Congo, and Dahomey. Slave traders scoured the Atlantic coast of Africa, and the slaves who arrived came from hundreds of different tribes, their languages often mutually incomprehensible. To regularize slavery, in 1685 Louis XIV enacted the Code Noir, which accorded certain human rights to slaves and responsibilities to the master, who was obliged to feed, clothe, and provide for the general well-being of their slaves. The Code Noir also sanctioned corporal punishment, allowing masters to employ brutal methods to instill in their slaves the necessary docility, while ignoring provisions intended to regulate the administration of punishments. A passage from Henry Christopher's personal secretary, who lived more than half his life as a slave, describes the crimes perpetrated against the slaves of Saint-Domingue by their French masters. Have they not hung up men with heads downward, drowned them in sacks, crucified them on planks, buried them alive, crushed them in mortars? Have they not forced him to eat excrement? And, having flayed them with the lash, have they not cast him alive to be devoured by worms, or onto anthills, or lashed them to stakes in the swamp to be devoured by mosquitoes? Have they not thrown them into boiling cauldrons of cane syrup? Have they not put men and women inside barrels studded with spikes and rolled them down mountainsides into the abyss? Have they not consigned these miserable blacks to man-eating dogs until the latter, sated by human flesh, left the mangled victims to be finished off with bayonet and poniard? Thousands of slaves found freedom by fleeing from their masters, forming communities of Maroons and raiding isolated plantations. The most famous was Macandal, a one-armed slave, originally from Guinea, who escaped in 1751. Ivodo Honguns, he united many of the different Maroon bands. He spent the next 6 years staging successful raids and evading capture by the French, reputedly killing over 6,000 people, while preaching a fanatic vision of the destruction of white civilization in Saint-Domingue. In 1758, after a failed plot to poison the drinking water of the plantation owners, he was captured and burned alive at the public square in Cap Français. Saint-Domingue also had the largest and wealthiest free population of color in the Caribbean, the gens de couleur. The mixed-race community in Saint-Domingue numbered 25,000 in 1789. First-generation gens de couleur were typically the offspring of a male French slave owner and an African slave chosen as a concubine. In the French colonies, the semi-official institution of blocage defined this practice. By this system, the children were free people and could inherit property, thus originating a class of mulattoes, with property and some with wealthy fathers. This class occupied a middle status between African slaves and French colonists. Africans who attained freedom also enjoyed status as gens de couleur. As numbers of gens de couleur grew, the French rulers enacted discriminatory laws. Statutes forbade gens de couleur from taking up certain professions, marrying whites, wearing European clothing, carrying swords or firearms in public, or attending social functions where whites were present. However, these regulations did not restrict their purchase of land, and many accumulated substantial holdings and became slave owners. By 1789, they owned 1/3 of the plantation property and 1/4 of the slaves of Saint-Domingue. Central to the rise of the gens de couleur planter class was the growing importance of coffee, which thrived on the marginal hillside plots to which they were often relegated. The largest concentration of gens de couleur was in the southern peninsula, the last region of the colony to be settled, owing to its distance from Atlantic shipping lanes and its formidable terrain, with the highest mountain range in the Caribbean.